So this is the final video in the post-progress series. Thank you for listening so far. And in the previous video we asked ourselves this question, what is it that we ultimately care about when it comes to our social lives? Is it that we ultimately care about achieving various outcomes in education, health, crime, economic growth, and so on? Or is it that we ultimately care about the process of being alive to our social issues and their underlying causes and responding as best as we can to them? And I talked a bit about what the difference will likely be if we decide that the process is ultimately more important than the outcomes. And I'm going to look at that in a bit more detail in this video and see how it gets us to this idea of post-progress politics, that the idea of progress itself, much like the idea of happiness in the post-happiness video series that I did, is so wrapped up in issues of control, domination, that we are better off moving beyond the idea of progress altogether and looking at a more process way of doing politics. So what does happen when we make this switch from control to connection, from outcomes to process? I think there's kind of two main ways in which this makes a difference. The first is on a more day-to-day level. We are more likely as citizens or as decision makers or as policy makers to be open to what we don't know. It's so common now, for example, in political discourse, that we have to be right all the time. To admit that we're wrong is a sign of weakness, and that's, crazy. If we want to find out what really works and what really matters, we need to make mistakes. We need to be wrong. We need to listen to as many perspectives as possible. So on a day-to-day level, I think we're more likely to be open to what we don't know. We're more likely to be curious. We're more likely to be compassionate for people who we might otherwise think are stupid, selfish, bad, evil, or wrong in some other way. So there's going to be more civil discourse. There's going to be more engagement from all areas of society. And there's going to be more experimentation too. So there may be more scope for random controlled trials in politics. There may be more scope for deliberative democracy and citizens' assemblies and things that don't necessarily guarantee us the right outcome immediately, but are part of this longer process of experimentation, exploration, curiosity in politics. Secondly, I think in the long term, we are more likely to hone in on the things that really matter. So the main thing that I think we're more likely to do in this respect is not just look at the immediate outcomes we can make through various policies, such as reducing crime by having more police officers on the street, or reducing ill health by having greater access to treatments. All of these things we should do, but we can also begin to hone in on the social causes of these things, on the underlying systemic reasons why we still have such high levels of health and mental health, such high levels of crime, such high levels of immigration, such high levels of intergenerational unemployment, things like this. We can begin to look at some of the really challenging systemic reasons, and that requires each person to understand that it's not just the fault of the other side. It's not just that the right policies aren't being adopted, but when it's a systemic problem, and we're seeing this, for example, with the Black Lives Matter movement, when it's a systemic problem, we are all part of that system. We are all, if we're on the privileged side, benefiting from that system. If we're all on the disadvantaged side, we're all losing from that system. So it requires not just, quickly adopt this policy and defeat everyone who's opposed to it. It requires actually really individually looking. It's not just a policy change that's going to change things. I need to change things too, or at least the right systemic policy change will change my life. And that's a much more challenging thing, and it's much of a more long-term process. To change the system in comparison to various policy levers is a much more difficult affair. It takes much longer. So Martin Luther King talked about the long arc of history. The arc of history, it bends, is long but bends towards justice, and that's the kind of hope and trust in this process that we need. We might not see the outcomes we want as in our lifetimes. We might not have them as urgently as we really think they need to come about, but we need to trust in that process. We almost need a kind of faith in politics that if we include the right perspectives, if we approach things in a kind and compassionate way, we can begin to adopt these sorts of principles into our politics. That if we have a kind of beloved community, that eventually things will go in the right direction. And that's challenging. That's challenging when there are pressing problems and we need to do things about them. And of course we do need to do things right now, but we can begin, I think, if we make this switch from control to connection, if we make this switch from outcomes to process, to also look at these underlying systemic causes, to look at the long-term story that we're all a part of and could be a part of. So that's why I think we can move beyond progress, which is primarily about the metrics of how we are getting better and better on a kind of daily and annual or decade basis. And we can't say that easily whether things are going in the right direction. We need instead to have a different idea of what social change looks like, and that's this post-progress idea to politics. Again, looking at the process, looking at connection rather than